let's talk about WG4, The Forgotten Temple of Tharizdun by Gary Gygax, the WG standing for World of Greyhawk. So it's not actually the fourth World of Greyhawk module, it's the first. I think, I forget exactly which way round they go, but I think it's that the possibly both editions of the Greyhawk campaign setting are WG1 and 2 respectively, and something else is WG3, maybe T1 is or something. There was some theory about reordering that never happened, but yeah, this is WG4, an adventure set on Greyhawk's world for character levels 5 to 10. And Gary ran it in his campaign. His son was one of the players. I watched, it wasn't an amazing stream, it was charming, but I watched him a few years ago. He played a game where the DM took them back to the Forgotten Temple. So and to say, it's interesting to note that this is the first branded Greyhawk adventure, even though everything previous by Gary has been in Greyhawk, and everything for AD&D has nominally been in Greyhawk already. And I think what we're seeing there is a realization that kind of the branding for the worlds is part of the sales strategy. I'll touch a bit more on some of that stuff as I go, the kind of branding up discussion. Some would say this is Gary's best module. Basically, heroes go to a dark, weird Cthulhian temple and do a bunch of stuff. They would say it's Gary's best work. I prefer D3 and S3, I think. But it does have a lot of what people like about Gary's work. It does a lot of different things. It has a wilderness adventure, it has a massive pitched battle, it has dungeon clearance thereafter, it has loads of lateral puzzle solving, it has atmospheric Cthulhu stuff, basically. It's a real milestone achievement. It is one of his longer modules, excluding map stuff. It is 32 pages, which and that's for a single location, basically. I mean, technically there's this wilderness adventure too. It has him operating at a high level of intensity and creativity. Before I'll do what I often do with these, but because it's a classic module, will be on paper rather than on screen. Some niggles first before I kind of go into it. Let's just go through this and talk about it, and mostly talk about what's good about it. Just some general niggles. It doesn't really know how to present itself. It sets itself up both as a tournament module where players, there's lots of box text, and the box text is not officially boxed at this point, but it's functionally boxed. A lot of it is telling, not showing. A lot of it is pretty average in terms of its writing quality. It's very directive. There's a lot of expectation on the DM to have certain things happen. But also, it's then like, oh, actually, it's a fairly open wilderness module which has a location in it. Just do what you want with it. And it's also an expansion or continuation of S4 Lost Caverns of Sojkanth, which I haven't reviewed on the channel, but I will in time. And all that's really interesting because it says to me on the note of marketing that you have here an early example, I think, of the pressure to market, not just market in terms of make something sound cool, but attempt to fit hypothetical objectives for players. Like some players just need, they just want a module that they're forced to go and do. Some players are going to want to continue from S4 where we set up this location. Indeed, it's at some level, though it is technically, I guess, a similar level to the Giants modules, slightly lower in fact, it can connect to those as well because the theming, but also maybe it's just something where a DM would want to dump it in the wilderness, and though this can all be easily resolved, you can just ignore the stylistic points you don't like. It's an incipient problem in TSR. I think it is in Wizards since as well, but in the TSR era, that you increasingly are driven not just by like bad design philosophy or anything like that, but also by a need to present certain products to the players or to the DMs in particular ways. And you see an example of this with products I like, tiny tangent, but products I like in the Player Handbook reference series for second edition. That the realization was that basically adventures, your DM buys them, that's one copy per group. Core books, maybe there's a couple of players' handbooks, but the DMG only one person buys. The monster stuff usually only one person buys. But the PHBRs and with Birthright, the player's secret books, you can, and indeed the campaign guide reference books like for Spacefarers, Shires, Gladiators, lots of players might like them. You might have a couple of copies in a group, maybe 3, in a group of 5 players and a DM, you might have 2 or 3 copies. You can sell more. And though we're not at that stage yet, we are at the point of trying to make something fit as many plausible markets as possible. I'd also say that there are lots of puzzles here. I like the puzzles. They're very Gygaxian. In fact, at points I think they are maybe too Gygaxian. What I mean is, and I'm not going to go into super detail as we go, but I'll pick them out. is that there's not always necessary enough for a capable party to easily solve them. I think this is worse in that respect than S1 is, than Tomb of Horrors is, because Tomb of Horrors is explicitly aggressive and unpleasant, and it's meant to be the ultimate challenge to players. Here, you have puzzles that don't entirely... How a player is going to glue the various things together, even via trial and error. You know, the trial and error is going to involve an enormous amount of error, let us say. Sometimes it feels like a 90s point-and-click adventure game where you just have to, like Discworld 2 or something, or a Broken Sword game. Indiana Jones is actually terrible for this, where you have to just randomly combine objects. You have to go and talk to everyone. Combine every object, talk to every person, go to every location, use every object in every location, and then you're like, I wouldn't have thought that combination of 3 things would work with this. In fact, I should say Discworld 2 is basically parodying that entire mode. But here, there's no limit to the number of objects you can interact with. And as a DM, you're going to have to start being very disciplined in information presentation to give even a capable party, maybe a genius party will be fine, but even a capable party any chance of solving them. There are also, final nickel, there are 2 potential main endings here, I think, for most parties. And though they're atmospheric, they're both fun. Neither has the level of some of Gary's other work as to excitement or flexibility. Compare D3, compare T4 if you like, if you want to put it that way. If you want to play that game, even consider the end of a very flawed module and the kind of stakes and the scale, and you know, I think that's something that here you end up having much, generally speaking, lower stakes, I think. But yes, let's go through it bit by bit. We have a main booklet and a double folder, cover and rear. In the inside we've got a wilderness map, which unlike some I've seen recently, you'll not be able to see, but at least I can pick out the numbers. I've read a few. It's something about the blueprint actually, is the numbers tend to be fairly clear, whereas on some of the grayscale 2nd edition maps you get for some stuff, you have numbers and letters that are identical to the background. You've got an aerial view of the temple from outside. You have an orcs layer, which is another location on the wilderness map. And you have the 2 main layers of the... 3 main floors of the temple. One is a very small floor, basically, and then you go down into the main temple layer, and then there are dungeons as well. There is also a sub-temple, under-temple, which is mapped in the booklet itself. It is for characters 5 to 10. You have a introduction, which is not necessarily that bad in terms of its stuff that you could reasonably give a lot of to players via rumours if they're investigating it. It has, it says background for the Dungeon Master, which is actually then really a player introduction, which is a fairly long read aloud, where the gnomes of Gnome Vale from Sojkanth ask for help, and you know, you have a party, you agree and you have a party, and that's the railroad introduction into having to do it. Obviously you can just ditch that. It's not amazingly written. Gary is, at his best, quite an atmospheric writer, but he is not a great writer, I think, at the best of, you know, as in he's not an all-time great writer of well, that's an alarm. He's not an all-time great writer of prose. He's just solid. One thing I should say that I know, thinking about D2, Shrine of the Kuatoa, is Gary's use of gnomes, and Sojkanth as well. Gary's use of gnomes shows us what he thinks gnomes are for. And I have time for lots of presentations of gnomes. I quite like 4th edition's Fey gnomes. The gnomes I run are kind of elven gnomes, rather than dwarven gnomes. I think I can have time for even tinker gnomes in very small doses as an effective sort of lateral humour opportunity. But I think the way that Gary runs them as rather kind of shy and reclusive, but capable rock dwellers. You know, above ground, these rock gnomes are willing combatants, but they're shy, reclusive. They're just trying to hide away from other people trying to hurt them. The Sverfneblin in D2 are a sort of underground, hidden society of warriors who you can ally with. There is something there which is not identical to dwarves. It is not identical to elves, and it is not identical to halflings. It is its own niche. And so, hey, if you hate gnomes, read some Gary modules and work out what he thinks gnomes are for and why he includes them. Notes the Dungeon Master, there are rules for tracking and starvation and food and water, and map movement on the map. One thing about the starvation rules is that, of course, these are, I think, the only rules for this exact rules for this kind of starvation. There's a mention about rest that isn't fully explained rules-wise, but Tilda Wilderness Survival Guide by Kim Moen. There are some rules in the DMG. There's some mentions in the 1E DMG, but I realised this trying to find rules for in the second edition DMG. Really, they all get cast off to a relatively short section in the Wilderness Survival Guide. In second edition, that's very egregious because there are so many wasted pages in that DMG. We then have a wilderness adventure. The wilderness adventure, that is half a page. Let's work it in 3.5, just over 3.5 pages of a wilderness adventure. So quite a short section of the whole, 10% of the whole. You've had 2.5 pages intro, 3.5 pages to kind of, and including the rules, plus the rules for it, for wilderness adventure. This is a solid wilderness adventure. It has a lot of locations. I think it has 18 locations or something, 19 maybe? No, 20 locations. And it has lots of valleys. One of them is the safe valley where you can hide out on the map. You can go around just doing adventures anyway, but you are looking for the temple ultimately. That's the aim of the game. So you go on the wilderness adventure to get clues, because people can give you clues as you go around. So for instance, there's the random encounters. So there is a table with all kinds of relatively dull stuff, ordinary stuff: avalanche, cave bears, wild boars. One thing is that one of the giants' parties on this can give you directions to the temple. They don't want to fight, they're just wandering around. And if you are friendly to them and offer them compensation, they will direct you off to the temple. Then you've got numbered encountered areas. There are 22 numbered encountered areas, some of which are, so not 20, some are generic is the point. Grassy valleys, rocky valleys, and etc. And some have no extra rules other than you roll an encounter. Some have extra things going on. So for instance, you have location 9, which is a rocky valley, is Plateau of the Aarakocra. You can ally with a small tribe of Aarakocra who the shaman there has cure light wounds, and they can together summon an air elemental. But they want you to help them with some griffins nearby who are hurting them. They will give you a dozen gems, so they give you a base value 1200. So it's not actually that much really for a 6th level party. It's fine. For a 10th level party, you'll probably think that's pretty small. But yes, to deal with these 4 griffins, and the griffins are not afraid of humans. They want to fight. Gary is an interesting thing. Gary both sets up interaction opportunities. There's giants who can talk to you, and there's giants who can attack you. But he is quite willing, a lot more willing than many new OSR designers, to just say, oh yeah, this is a battle to the death, they just want to kill you. And that belies in part the wargame rules. He expects his players want to have a big fight sometimes, and that's fine, he thinks. But yes, the griffins you go and fight and kill, and there's some treasure there. I would say a belt of gold, 4,500 gold piece value, much more valuable than what you get from the Aarakocra. Something to bear in mind. A good classic design trick is to create the rewards at the end point, not at the start point. You can offer a job, it is worth this much, you'll level up this much, but in fact you should go and find stuff and get that, and that's the real kind of XP dump. Safe Valley, Temple, the Valley of the Lucrotta. In fact, they have 2 of them. One Lamia and 4 Lucrotta have these 2 valleys. And this is again basically a set of combat encounters. There is some treasure in one of them with not loads of stuff. 1,800 gold piece bracelet is the big thing. But then this sets up, because they are enemies of the Orcs, the Gorge of the Orcs. There is a tribe of Orcs, of the Rotting Eye tribe, belonging to the clan of the Jagged Knife. And this is a small, in fact, a useful thing to realise is this is a small training scenario for the temple itself. It reminded me, in one sense, of the way in which ASE 1, Anonymous Subsurface Environment 1, sets up and trains players into what it's doing, in that it has a very small dungeon, the Mokhtar layer, then it has a level 1 dungeon essentially. It's almost a level 0 dungeon, a level 1 dungeon in the gatehouse before you open up the mountain as a whole, and then you learn really how the game works that way. Then you open up the mountain as a whole, and technically there are multiple entrances. You can very quickly descend anyway, just via from level 1 you can get down to, you know, level 2, 3, etc. Here we have the Orcs Lair. Yeah, you can see it is not an uninteresting map. It is not a record-breaking map, but there is there's a core loop, which is kind of here. There's bypasses there. In fact, the way that loop works, there are 3 routes through. That itself is not very interesting because you're not going to skip very much. But there is then a sub-loop up here. So you have a couple of small loops just to keep it interesting. And you've got things, you know, the chief's room, the shaman's room, the sub-chief, the treasure room, and females and young. And you've got to kind of push through various combat areas to get to the main treasure. Because if you are trying to go and get the Lamir's missing treasure, because I don't think she wants to ally with you. I think basically she is largely happy to attack you and kill you. But if you're like, is there more treasure? And that's one thing he doesn't make clear, that really there should be an opportunity where the Lamia wants you to go and get her treasure rather than just for dinner or something. There's an opportunity there missed. But yeah, you get 3 main groups of orcs who you have to fight through, and there are multiple versions of these, I think, multiple iterations, and then there is also the kind of the chief and the shaman and stuff, who I think there's only 1 of each. And there's loads of treasure there. I mean, there's 200 electrum, 90 gold pieces, 23 base 50 GP gems, a amber flask of perfume worth 1300, potion of polymorph. Gary, this is one thing I've thought before. Gary's treasure is solid without often being exciting. You occasionally find, and you find this generally deeper in dungeons, to be fair, genuinely quite exciting and interesting, varied treasure. But I think he is happier with generic stuff than many people now, when they're writing, you know, who are trying to come up with interesting different treasures, might be. He also only occasionally pulls some of the griefier tricks, like, it's a vase, how are you going to store it? He very comparatively rarely offers complex treasure. Then there's the temple. The temple is the main affair, and this is, you know, obviously most of the book. This is 26 pages of the book, or 24 pages of the book, 2/3. There's also 2 monsters at the end and 2 magic items. So, what you have, and this requires some interpretation, but you've got an overview map of the way that you get up to the temple, and then you need to switch, I think, possibly to this map, which shows you the way that the 2 mountains right next to the temple work. That is then a keyed environment which has sort of some basic information on it, and which is relevant because it relates to the way the temple is defended. It then gives detailed order of battle notes about a few different things. First, well, it gives tactical notes first, is actually, I suppose, the thing. The order of battle is slightly later. It gives tactical notes first about reinforcements, random encounters, defense of the upper level, slipping and falling, particularly if you're, which is relevant if you're out on the ravine at the front. Defense in general, superior dungeon mastering. It is absolutely necessary you be completely familiar with the levels and the inhabitants of them in order to properly DM this scenario. It's far easier to wing an outdoor adventure than a dungeon one, and this is no exception. One of the classics of Gary adventures, and this is one of the reasons we should value them, is that you have someone who has thought about this a lot, who's come up with most of the ideas involved, and is quite happy to tell you as a DM reading this is how you run the game. And that can be invasive, but I think actually the advice is nearly always better than, because the advice later on tends to be, the players won't enjoy it if you don't do this, so do this and make sure they enjoy it, which is bad advice. That's not how really any game works. But saying, look, when you're running the game, when you're in a freeform area where you can wander around and do stuff and improvise, and one valley is much like another, and the areas are quite large, and the time spent crossing them is somewhat abstract, or in the sense that you need to keep the time records, whether it's 20 minutes or 40 minutes is often, unless a spell is up, not relevant. In a dungeon, where you're doing quite different things, it really matters, where you have a much more compact area. and where the challenge comes often from careful mapping, exploration and puzzle solving, then you need to be a lot more careful about record keeping and understanding the situation. And he's just given you a very, very broad, expansive wilderness adventure in a few pages, and now he's going to give you a much more, you know, and only about as an expansive, really, when you think about it, dungeon adventure in much more detail because he thinks it needs it. He then, then information about the upper level and where the guards are. The main guards you deal with at first are gnolls and Norkers, and Norkers are kind of a large goblinoid, who obviously are made as a higher level goblin. There is then the interior of that. They're outside, and then it gives you an order of battle here. The order of battle is useful. It's solid, and it's basically, if you've been presented in some ways as a here's a record of all the order of them, that'd be good. It also tries to put in reinforcement information, and that's good. It makes it a lot easier to run. We are talking about, I'll sum it up in a second, but an enormous battle here. But what I'd say is that you also have all these monsters referenced in their own areas, so that's why you need to know what refers to what, and you need to be able to have double records, basically. So, you have dozens of Norkers overall, loads of ogres, a witch doctor, a couple of dozen gnolls as well, and a bunch of trolls. 6 trolls led by, including a giant troll. There is then also 2 hill giants and a mountain giant who are the leaders. I should say, in the order of battle, he does give room references for where these guys come from, which helps. Hill giant, led by a mountain giant, Grog, who is the leader. This is a chaotic temple, but it is fairly well led by the mountain giant. There are then, however, extra notes here, more tactical notes, saying what happens as things go wrong. If essentially the baddies think they've been defeated, because they're pouring reinforcements up, the players are probably going to have to retreat at least once, maybe twice, and then that's going to allow some defences to be reset before they go back in on essentially a frontal assault. This is not something he has designed really before. The nearest thing is not giants, where a lot more stealth is typical, but Kuotoa, Shrine of the Kuotoa, where once you're revealed, there tends to be, it very quickly devolves into running battles. And I think that's going to be a very typical experience. If you don't sneak in, sneak out on a specific objective, you're going to get into a series of running battles with large numbers of bad guys. So, so it gives advice about, well, they're going to retreat, they go down these doors, these stairs, they'll try to escape to these places, and that, you know, they will collapse as a fighting force if you break them in that way because they're chaotic. If they were lawful, he makes the observation here, if the monsters were of lawful alignment, organisation plans and timings would be well determined in advance and a defence would be better overall. However, these fellows are chaotic. One thing, as I've got a couple of bits of art coming up, art is all by the same person, Karen Nelson. Some of it is quite nice or interesting, and it's quite illustrative. There's some cultists of Tharizdun. Those are probably the player characters when they wear some robes. And then there's, you've got stuff like this, which is a bit vaguer. Littered quarters, I think this represents, with pillows. Now, it's interesting here that what you have is, you've got all these monsters who are being drawn into the service of Grog, the mountain giant, but they are not really representative of what used to happen in this temple. It is a forgotten temple. In terms of magic, you immediately start to find interesting things here, by the way, such as a pillow that's rather lumpy with feathers, but one of the feathers is a Qual's feather token, for instance, or a piece of jade worth 1,000 in the ashes of a fire. Gygaxian treasure. I won't repeat this, but he's at his most obnoxious with treasure finding here. He's assuming these are expert players and an expert DM, and there are plenty of quite difficult rooms with no treasure. There is later on there is the dungeons, the actual kind of prison has doors, all of which are full of ear seekers, none of which have treasure. They each have like 4 ear seekers. Incredibly obnoxious trap. But he's thinking much, and this is where the parallel to S1 comes up again, albeit again S1 is explicitly an aggressive module, is the assumption his players are experts and want this challenge. You then go downstairs, and there is an increasing amount of interesting weird stuff. The atmospherics are good. This mauve chamber, it could be of highly polished stone. None of you have ever seen anything like it before, so you're uncertain as to what it is. The substance seems mineral nature and it's as hard as granite. The floor and ceiling of the polished obsidian seen are elsewhere, but the floor has pyramids inside on it, one every few feet, or with bases to the north, points to the south. The ceiling also seems to have carving in bas relief. Peering upwards, you think that it shows patterns of tentacles and human figures interlocked, but the work is so intricate as to make a certain identification impossible. The trolls in that room have some very, very valuable but potentially damageable treasure. A gold ring with a diamond worth 3,000, a fragile jade bracelet worth 5,000, some potentially expired incense and meditation. There's then an inset area, and this is very important because this is how you get down to what's essentially the true temple, or at least the ultimate temple, the under temple. And this is a secret doors kind of system where you have to work out the ways different doors rotate. And this isn't actually impossibly hard. Parties will miss it, but it's not impossibly hard. And a big thing is it contains a bunch of robes and iron thuribles, and I think there's 7 robes possibly and a bunch of thuribles, and holders for cones and of incense, which do not seem to burn with any heat or light. They burn, they consume above ground, but they don't do anything. You have to be in the Undertemple for them to work, because Tharizdun is a darkness aspected god or thing. Of course, the Elder Elemental Eye, Tharizdun, these things come up in Giants and in parts of, or versions of, the Temple of Elemental Evil. You've got Anis hags who are pretending to be human slaves. You can find them. Oh yeah, you also need a horn, a magical horn. You go back into the main place. There are Anis cooks who are pretending to be human slaves. There's the mountain giant. He will attempt to retreat with the most valuable treasure above ground. He has one chest with like 15,000 worth of stuff in it. Another with a bunch of interesting bits and pieces. Another with electrum pieces. Well, over 4,000 coins, electrum and silver. He's got a lot of treasure. One thing is, and this is interesting, that Gary does say, look, these rooms were this in the old temple, but he often wants to make it very clear, and you can tell it. There is no doubt this 10 by 30 room of polished blackstone was at one time a scriptorium, and then it says why. This is not necessarily bad information for the DM in some ways, but I think it ends up taking a fairly large number of words to tell the player stuff they don't need to know. And we do find this very obnoxious in modern modules that do it. And you can see that Gary had a propensity to overwrite, which is surprising, not what you'd think necessarily, but I think it is there, and it's often there. This is worse than other modules of his, I think, for it. Various weird colours, different colours of purple rooms, different monsters, plenty of places with poor treasure or not much treasure, but maybe usable stuff. 3 barrels of oil and a jug of strong acid is the only treasure in the scriptorium, for instance. But you can use that stuff. Very, very useful, in fact. More ogres. Then, yeah, you get the upper temple, which is actually is more or less the home of the giant troll and some brown mould, pretty much, and some Norkas. And then there is a place beyond that side of the temple, beyond the core temple, where the Witch Doctor is. The Witch Doctor is there's a little bit of art. The Witch Doctor is a decently dangerous monster. 21 HP, so not incredible. I mean, only 3 hit dice plus 2. 21 HP, but 5th level cleric, 2nd level magic user, with a scroll of Gust of Wind, as well as lots of other spells. And particularly affect normal fires at 1st level, plus 3 2nd level resist fires. He sets everything on fire and then protects after protecting him and his friends. He says, first you resist fire, then he'll do other stuff, particularly including affect normal fires. Then you can go down. There are stairs down, accessible, not secret, unlike to the Undertemple, not secret stairs down to the dungeon level. And the dungeon level is kind of full of, it has a bunch of weird idols, and it has if you have the horn, you can then make these 4 idols, which are each, I guess, inspirationally, they're all like this one. They all look different. They all have different effects when you interact with them. But yeah, you toot the horn, and you're asked what aspect of Eternal Tharizdun would you see, and then he has a pretty useful keyword list. If players say anything like this, activate this idol. If they mock them, then they get attacked, basically. But if you ask for help from Tharizdun, then in fact you get something potentially. One of these kind of opens up and yeah, you must first do that which is bid, let it be known to you, then shall thou be favoured. Basically, you are being told what you might need to do elsewhere, particularly in the Undertemple. It's giving you extra clues. Then there's a few other rooms, including some Boggarts who are introduced here. Boggarts are kind of a fun but quite dumb monster. They are immature will-o'-the-wisps who aren't undead, I guess, therefore they're... So they are shape-shifting, weird little fae, essentially, who turn into will-o'-the-wisps when they grow up. And that could be an entertaining thing. They want rescuing. They turn into halflings who also want rescuing. They keep attacking you and turning into other things, then they run away. There's some Otchug in a dump. There's a stun jelly hiding on the edge of an empty chamber. There is a grell. There are ear seekers in the torture chamber on each of the doors. There's lots of kind of classic. In one sense, it's monster zooing it in a fairly naturalistic way. Oh, these are things that you might find in such a place. They're all pretty close to each other, and there's no interactive ecology once you're down in the dungeon level. Whatever survivors have fled from above are down there in their homes. You've got to clear them out. And then there's these others, you know, ear seekers, Otchug, stun jelly. The dungeon level, the upper level, is a great pitch battle with great details, which is something he never does in quite the same way. The dungeon is more like other things he's done and has some cool interactions, but is not necessarily as effective as other things. Other examples are the same from him. I'd say this central section, the dungeon section, is probably no better than plenty of Temple of Elemental Evil, which is, by the point you're in the temple, is a solid but not amazing module from him and Mensa. And there is a fun guardian demon with loads of treasure, I mean as in tens of thousands of treasure, and who a tough party can beat. He's got horrendous special attacks, he's got lots of special defense, but he only has 64 HP. And if you work out what might be going on, if you drop him with cold magic, if you've got good magic weapons, you're level 7 or 8, you should have a bunch of +2 weapons by then. Once you do design point, you can see, Tony Husso's talked about this, you can see the way Gary designs stuff is that players, as they hit these levels, should have lots of magic items, basically. And that's part of the game. It's not a Monty Hall if they're items they've earned and they need, and that they'll die without. It becomes part of the competitive improvement curve. Then there's Caryatid Columns, Coffer Corpse, and there are Measles who have the final big lot of treasure. And then there's the place for a last stand for the Mountain Giant, and then a passage out the back way. Which, which I don't think you can access from the other side. I don't think you're told about, but is a potentially another secret way in. Then there is the Undertemple, which is the remaining. It's 3 and a bit pages, or 4 and a bit pages. No, 3 and a bit. 3 and a bit pages. It's not that long. Then again, it only has 9 rooms, and they are. You can see there's one map there. That's the upper level, and there's the lower level. They're very simple rooms, but they're basically an extended set of puzzles. And though I kind of complained at the start, what I would say is this is the final challenge and the big bonus area, and essentially I think Gary would probably say, yeah, I want players to be screwed over by how hard this is. That's the point, that's the game. And I think if you accept that and you see that as a part of the dynamic, then it's not upsetting, is it? But it certainly is something where you come in and there's a voice which tells you about to look above you to know your fate. When you see glowing black runes that you understand, you're told, those who I find unfit I place on my left, those who succeed I place on my right. The chosen may come before me, which kind of does refer to the rooms ahead, and so you can work it out, but then, so you've got to work that out. You're already cold, it's already difficult, light is already not working, and the cones are ideally the way to do stuff. Then there's a shadow demon, which, again, I mean, 53 HP, not itself crazy, but pretty brutal in terms of the number of defences it has. Does it have MR? I would have thought it had MR, but I can't see that. Yeah, so it can magic jar your magic user. It has a wand of light. That's the only treasure. This is how. This is where Gary's at on this. He wants to screw you over. There is an octagonal chamber where in front of you, where if you get the horn and the cones right, everything gets really cold. You start to take damage if your robes if you're not wearing the special robes, and you have to work out that you have to swing the thuribles, and then the vapors turn into stuff. You can take damage from the vapors, but then there will be a portal with an archway once the smoke has gone, and then you can go into the Black Cyst, the under temple. There are several steps here which, as I say, will be at the trial, error kind of level of success. Then finally there is a room full of trees, which again, an opalescent black tree, which gives fighters bonuses, a deep green tree for clerics, an indigo blue tree for magic users, and a metallic crimson tree for thieves, and a smoky purple tree for any others. And they each can, if touched once by the right class, improve prime requisite stat, or the purple tree can do con or charisma. If you keep touching them, they hurt you and eventually will kill you. And that's fine. I actually think the kind of greed and learning the dynamic is fine, but again, it's very lateral. How will you know which is which, you know? And because you're taking a lot of damage, as in you're taking 3d10 if you go for the wrong class, which you've got down there, you might well be pretty weak by the time you get down there. The flip side, I should say, is you can rest. If you clear the dungeon above, why not rest? You know, if you're a clever player, you make sure you're back up to your 35, 40, 50 health before you go down to this final level. The Black Cyst, all very cold. There is another final puzzle to do, which is chiefly about the cones of light and the horn again, and then there is a secret room with treasure in it. Wand of Force is one of them, a very heavily trapped box with the 333 gems of Tharizdun, which might be a rumour that takes you there, but only 2d4 are of the great 5000 GP or better, the rest are cheap. Then and that one thing, it does have a cube of force attached to it, so you can get that as well. And then there is a weird book which makes your mind go blank and you take a bunch of functioning psychic damage, 3d10. But if you what it is the subject of a later revelation. If the party wishes to dispose of it, it's worth 33,000 gold pieces. You can see that there's high level rewards there, some very good treasure. It is weird in a way that it's not maybe as big or as impressive as you'd expect, I think. It's not as massive as you'd expect. It's interesting, the puzzles are complex, multi-stage, very lateral. That's not a criticism, but it is a fact. I think the strongest part of it, or two strongest parts of it, are the pitched battle and then the sort of atmospherics of the lower temple as things get weirder and weirder. And that's a parallel to what happens in Giants, in the dungeons of G3, is it? And you're like, oh wow, this is all kind of or is it G1? This is all increasingly dark and strange. You know, that's very effective there. And yeah, it's G3, isn't it? And here it does that as well. And I enjoyed that a lot. I think the Wilderness Adventure is solid without really popping. I think there are better, albeit longer, early Wilderness Adventures. X1 is the obvious one you'd go for, but I1 does a kind of micro Wilderness Adventure very well as well. And the kind of the dungeon clearance is pretty rote, is not his best, but is very good. It's not his best. And the final puzzle areas are interesting without necessarily being genre breaking. One thing he does do is show a way forward, and that's what I think we generally take from it for me, is that he breaks new ground and he spins old ideas, the puzzle rooms, in a new way, and we can do that again ourselves. So yeah, I like WG4. I think it is very good. I think it's very interesting. I don't rate it quite as highly as some people do. Tell me what you think, if you have read it or run it, in the comments, and I guess what are your other favourite Gygax modules. Till next time.